The morning started like any other Tuesday. James dragged his carry-on through the crowded airport terminal, dodging families with strollers and business travelers glued to their phones. He had his boarding pass pulled up on his phone, coffee in hand, and exactly 45 minutes before his flight to Seattle would take off. He'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Not because Seattle was particularly exciting, but because this meeting could change everything for his small software company. 3 years of late nights and weekend coding sessions had led to this moment. A major tech firm wanted to discuss acquiring his app, and James needed to be sharp, focused, and well-rested for the presentation. That's why he'd paid the extra $35 for seat 12C, an aisle seat with extra legroom. At 6'3", James wasn't built for cramped middle seats, and his lower back had been giving him trouble lately. His doctor had even written a note about it, though James hoped he wouldn't need to pull that card. Boarding started right on time. James shuffled down the narrow aisle searching for row 12. He found it easily enough, stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled into his seat. The familiar routine was almost comforting. Seatbelt clicked, phone on airplane mode, neck pillow adjusted just right. He was reviewing his presentation notes on his tablet when he heard someone clear their throat above him. "Excuse me, sir." James looked up to see a flight attendant standing there, her name tag reading Patricia. Behind her stood a young couple, probably in their mid-20s, holding hands and looking slightly uncomfortable. "Yes," James said, pulling out one earbud. Patricia smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Would you mind doing us a favor? These two are on their honeymoon and we're trying to get them seats together. Would you be willing to switch with one of them? There's a nice seat available in row 19. James glanced past her at the couple. They did look newly married, kind of glowing with that fresh wedding happiness. The guy gave him an apologetic shrug. "Row 19? James asked. "Is that an aisle seat?" "It's a middle seat," Patricia said, her smile tightening slightly. "But it's just a 2-hour flight. I'm sure you understand." James felt that familiar knot forming in his stomach. He hated confrontation. Always had. But he also knew what middle seats in row 19 meant. Squeezed between strangers, no room to move. His knees jammed against the seat in front of him for 2 hours. And he'd specifically paid extra to avoid exactly that scenario. "I appreciate you asking," James said carefully, "but I actually paid for this specific seat. I've got some back problems and I really need the aisle for my legs." "I'm sorry." The couple nodded understandingly. The wife whispered something to her husband about it being okay. But Patricia's expression changed completely. The professional mask slipped, and something harder showed through. "Sir, it's just a seat," she said, her voice dropping the friendly tone. "These people are on their honeymoon. Surely you can be a little flexible." James felt his face getting warm. Other passengers were starting to look over now, and he could feel their eyes on him. Great. Now he was going to be the jerk who ruined the honeymoon. "I understand that," James said, trying to keep his voice level. "And I'm happy for them. But I specifically chose and paid for this seat because of my back. I'm not trying to be difficult." "It's really okay," the young husband said quickly. "We can sit separately. It's not a big deal." But Patricia wasn't letting it go. She crossed her arms and James could see the irritation plainly on her face now. "The airline appreciates passengers who are willing to help each other out," she said, her tone suggesting that James was definitely not one of those appreciated passengers. "It's really not that much to ask." James took a deep breath. He'd been flying for 15 years and had never had a problem like this. He'd always been the easy passenger, the one who said yes to everything, who never complained. But this time he couldn't. He physically couldn't sit in a middle seat for 2 hours without his back seizing up, and he shouldn't have to anyway. He'd paid for this seat fair and square. "I'm sorry," James said firmly, "but my answer is no. I'm staying in my assigned seat." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, and James could practically see her mentally labeling him as a problem passenger. Without another word, she turned and guided the young couple down the aisle to find their separate seats. The husband looked back and mouthed, "Sorry," to James, who nodded back. The passengers around him slowly returned to their phones and magazines, but James could still feel the judgment hanging in the air. The woman across the aisle gave him a look that clearly said she thought he was selfish. The older man in the window seat of his row didn't make eye contact. James tried to return to his presentation notes, but his hands were shaking slightly. He hated this feeling. He wasn't a confrontational person. He wasn't trying to ruin anyone's day. He just wanted to sit in the seat he'd paid for. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. James started to relax, thinking maybe that was the end of it. He pulled up his presentation slides again, making mental notes about which points to emphasize during his pitch. Then he saw Patricia coming back down the aisle, and his stomach dropped. She wasn't alone this time. Walking beside her was another flight attendant, older, male, with the bearing of someone in charge. His name tag said Robert, and underneath it, Senior Flight Attendant. They stopped right at James's row, and Patricia pointed at him like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. "That's him," she said. Robert looked down at James with an expression of barely concealed annoyance, and in that moment James knew this was about to get much worse. "Sir," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "I understand there's been some difficulty with you this morning." James's heart started pounding. Difficulty? All he'd done was say no to switching seats. That wasn't difficulty. That was just exercising his right to sit where he'd been assigned. "I'm not sure what you mean," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just declined to switch seats." "You refused to help out a couple on their honeymoon," Patricia interjected, her tone accusatory. "And you were quite rude about it." "That's not true," James said, feeling a surge of panic now. "I was polite. I just said I needed to stay in my seat because of my back." Robert held up a hand, silencing them both. He looked at James with cold, appraising eyes like he was sizing up a problem that needed to be solved. "We've had a complaint about your behavior," Robert said, "and I'm going to need you to either cooperate and move to the available seat, or we're going to have to address this situation differently." James sat there, stunned, trying to process what was happening. A complaint? About him? He'd barely said 20 words to anyone. This couldn't be real, but the looks on their faces told him it was very, very real. James felt like the walls of the plane were closing in on him. Robert, the senior flight attendant, stood there with his arms crossed, waiting for an answer. Patricia stood beside him with that satisfied look people get when they think they've won an argument. "I'm sorry," James said, trying to keep his voice from shaking, "but I don't understand what I've done wrong. I just said I wanted to stay in my assigned seat. That's not being difficult. That's not being rude. I paid for this seat specifically." Robert's jaw tightened. "Sir, when a crew member makes a reasonable request, we expect passengers to comply." "You're disrupting the boarding process and causing problems for other passengers." James looked around. The plane was nearly full now, and at least 30 people were watching this unfold like it was a reality TV show. Some had their phones out. Nobody was disrupting anything except the 2 flight attendants standing in the aisle making a scene. "I'm not disrupting anything," James said, his frustration starting to break through. "You came to me. I'm sitting quietly in my assigned seat, the seat I paid for. The seat that's printed right here on my boarding pass." He held up his phone, showing the digital boarding pass with 12C clearly marked. Patricia leaned in closer to Robert and whispered something James couldn't quite hear, but he caught the words aggressive and refused. His blood ran cold. Aggressive? He'd been nothing but polite, maybe a little firm, but definitely not aggressive. "Look," James said, trying a different approach. "I have a back condition. I can show you documentation from my doctor if you need it. I physically cannot sit comfortably in a middle seat for 2 hours. That's why I specifically chose this aisle seat. It's not about being difficult or uncooperative." Robert didn't even look at the phone. "That's not the issue here, sir. The issue is your attitude and your refusal to work with our crew. Now I'm going to give you one more chance to move to the available seat in row 19, or we're going to have to take further action." Further action. The words hung in the air like a threat, and James suddenly realized how serious this had become. His mouth went dry. "What kind of further action?" he asked quietly. "We can have you removed from this aircraft," Robert said, his voice loud enough that half the plane could hear. "The captain has final authority on who flies, and if a crew member reports a disruptive passenger, we take that very seriously." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Removed from the plane? For wanting to sit in his own seat? This had to be some kind of nightmare. He'd wake up any minute in his apartment and this whole crazy situation would disappear. But the hard plastic of the armrest under his hand felt very real. So did the dozens of eyes staring at him. "This is insane," James muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What was that?" Patricia snapped. "Are you being disrespectful now too?" "No," James said quickly, holding up his hands. No, I'm not. I'm just trying to understand how this escalated so fast. I said no to switching seats. That's it. That's literally all I did. An older woman in the row behind James suddenly spoke up. He's right, you know. I saw the whole thing. He was perfectly polite when you asked him to move. He just said no. There's nothing wrong with that. James felt a wave of gratitude toward this stranger, but Patricia whirled on her immediately. Ma'am, I need you to stay out of this. This is between us and this passenger. I'm just saying what I saw, the woman said, not backing down. And what I saw was you two harassing a man for not giving up the seat he paid for. Robert's face flushed red. Ma'am, if you continue to interfere, you'll be removed as well. The woman sat back in her seat, but James could see she was angry. At least someone saw what was really happening here. At least he wasn't going crazy. I want to speak to the captain, James said suddenly. It was the only thing he could think of. If the captain had final authority, maybe the captain would see how ridiculous this was. The captain is busy preparing for departure, Robert said dismissively. You can speak to me. I'm the senior flight attendant, and I'm telling you that you need to move to row 19 or exit the aircraft. James's mind raced. His meeting in Seattle was critical. If he got kicked off this flight, he'd miss it entirely. There were no other flights that would get him there in time. 3 years of work could evaporate because of this insane situation, but something in him refused to give in. This was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. He hadn't done anything to deserve this treatment. No, James said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. I'm not moving, and I'm not getting off this plane. I've done nothing wrong. You're harassing me because I exercise my right to stay in my assigned seat. That's not a crime. That's not being disruptive. And I'm not going anywhere. Robert's eyes narrowed. He pulled out his radio and pressed the button. Ground security to gate 23. We have a non-compliant passenger who needs to be removed from the aircraft. James's heart hammered in his chest. This was really happening. They were really going to do this. His hands fumbled for his phone and he opened the camera app with shaking fingers. What are you doing? Patricia demanded. I'm recording this, James said, hitting the record button. For my protection and yours. I want documentation of exactly what's happening here. You can't record us without permission, Patricia said, reaching for his phone. James pulled it back. Actually, I can. We're in a public space and I'm documenting what I believe to be an unlawful removal. I'm not being disruptive. I'm not being aggressive. I'm sitting in my assigned seat and you're having me removed for refusing to give it up. He spoke clearly into the camera, making sure every word was captured. My name is James Chen. It's Tuesday, April 15th, approximately 8:45 a.m. I'm on Flight 447 from Chicago to Seattle. I was asked to switch seats. I politely declined. And now I'm being threatened with removal from the aircraft despite having done nothing wrong. Robert tried to grab the phone, but James held it away from him. Several other passengers had their phones out now too, recording the confrontation. The whole thing was being documented from multiple angles. This is your last warning, Robert said, his face now bright red. Turn off that phone and exit the aircraft. I'm not turning off anything, James said. And I'm not exiting. You're going to have to drag me off this plane, and when you do, the whole world is going to see exactly what happened here. 2 airport security officers appeared at the front of the plane, their uniforms and serious expressions cutting through the tension like a knife. James felt his stomach drop. This was it. This was really happening. The officers made their way down the aisle, and every passenger they passed went silent. By the time they reached row 12, you could have heard a pin drop. What's the situation? The taller officer asked Robert. This passenger is being disruptive and refusing crew instructions, Robert said immediately. We need him removed from the aircraft. The officer turned to James. Sir, is that accurate? James held up his phone, still recording. No, officer, it's not. I was asked to give up my assigned seat. I politely declined. That's all that happened. I have it recorded. Other passengers saw it too. I've been sitting here quietly this entire time until they came back and started threatening me. The officer looked at Robert, then at Patricia, then back at James. Is there a safety issue here? He's being non-compliant with crew instructions, Robert repeated. What instruction did you give him? To move to a different seat. Was there a safety reason for the move? Robert hesitated for just a second, and in that second, James saw it. The officer saw it too. Sir, the officer said to James, his tone more gentle now, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane with us and sort this out at the gate. The crew has authority on the aircraft, and if they're asking you to leave, we need to comply with that. James felt tears of frustration burning in his eyes. This wasn't fair. This wasn't right, but he could see he had no choice. Fine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll go. As he stood up and gathered his things, the older woman behind him said loudly, "This is wrong. Everyone here knows it's wrong." Several other passengers murmured in agreement, but James barely heard them. He was too focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Walking down that aisle with his head up, his phone still recording, and his entire future crumbling around him. The walk down the jetway felt like the longest walk of James's life. Each step echoed in the enclosed space, and he could feel the security officers flanking him on either side. Not touching him, not restraining him, but there, a constant reminder that he was being removed from a flight like some kind of criminal. His phone was still in his hand, still recording, capturing the fluorescent lights overhead and the gray carpeted floor of the jetway. His other hand gripped the handle of his carry-on, knuckles white from squeezing too hard. When they emerged into the gate area, a few people looked up from their phones and magazines. James wondered what they saw. A troublemaker being escorted off a plane, a threat to passenger safety, or just another tired traveler having a bad day. A woman in an airline uniform hurried toward them. Her name tag identified her as Linda Martinez, gate supervisor. She looked to be in her 50s with sharp eyes that took in the whole scene in seconds. "What's going on here?" she asked, directing her question to the security officers. The taller officer spoke first. "Flight crew requested removal of this passenger. Said he was being disruptive and non-compliant with crew instructions." Linda turned her attention to James. "Is that true, sir?" James took a breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Everything felt jumbled and surreal. "No, ma'am. I was asked to give up my assigned seat. I said no. That's all that happened. I have video." He held up his phone and Linda's eyebrows rose slightly. "You recorded the interaction?" "Yes, ma'am. For my protection. I felt like the situation was escalating unfairly, and I wanted documentation of what actually happened." Linda looked at the security officers. "Can you two wait here for a moment? I need to understand this situation before we go any further." The officers stepped back a few feet, giving them space but staying close enough to intervene if needed. Linda gestured toward the counter area. "Come with me. Let me see what we're dealing with here." James followed her behind the counter, his heart still pounding. Linda pulled up something on her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was checking his record, he realized. Looking at his flight history, his passenger profile, whatever information the airline kept on file. "You're a gold member," she said, more to herself than to him. "Flying with us for what, looks like 12 years? No incidents, no complaints, no problems." She looked up at him. "So what happened today?" James set his phone on the counter, pulled up the video and hit play. Linda leaned in, watching carefully. James watched her face as the scene unfolded on the small screen. He saw her expression shift from neutral to concern to something that looked like anger. The video showed everything. Patricia's initial request. James's polite refusal. The explanation about his back. Patricia's return with Robert. The accusations. The threats. The escalation. And through it all, James's voice remained calm and reasonable. Never raising, never cursing, never being what anyone could honestly call aggressive. When the video ended, Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she played it again and again. Each time, her frown deepened. "Wait here," she said finally, picking up a phone. She moved a few feet away, but James could still hear fragments of her conversation. "Yes, I need to speak with the senior attendant on Flight 447. I don't care if they're preparing for departure. This is urgent." While Linda was on the phone, James pulled out his laptop and opened his email. His hands were still shaking, but he managed to type out a message to his contact in Seattle. "Unavoidable delay. We'll keep you posted." He couldn't bring himself to explain what had really happened. It sounded too absurd even in his own head. Linda returned, her professional mask firmly in place, but her eyes showing something else. Anger, maybe. Or disgust. "Mr. Chen, I've reviewed your video and your passenger record. I've also pulled the flight's boarding records and your seat purchase history. You paid $35 extra for that specific aisle seat, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you have a documented medical condition requiring aisle seating?" "I have chronic lower back pain." My doctor recommended I avoid middle seats on flights longer than an hour. I can show you the documentation if you need it. Linda shook her head. That won't be necessary. What I'm seeing here is that you exercised your right as a paying passenger to remain in your assigned seat, and you were threatened with removal for doing so. She paused. That's not how we do business. James felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in his chest. So I can get back on the plane? Linda's expression tightened. It's not that simple. Once a crew member has requested a passenger's removal and security has been involved, there are protocols. But I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Chen. What I'm seeing here concerns me greatly. This situation should never have escalated this way. She made another call, this time to someone higher up the chain. James caught words like improper protocol and potential liability and social media exposure. That last one made his stomach flip. Social media? He hadn't even thought about that. But other passengers had been recording too. That older woman who'd spoken up for him. The people across the aisle. In today's world, videos didn't stay private for long. Linda hung up and turned back to him. Okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to rebook you on the next available flight to Seattle. First class, no charge. You'll arrive about 3 hours later than planned. I'm also issuing you a full refund for this flight and a travel voucher for future use. What about the crew members who did this? James asked. Are they going to face any consequences? Linda's expression became carefully neutral. That will be handled internally. I can't discuss personnel matters with you, but I can tell you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. James nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but he understood the position she was in. And the couple? The honeymoon couple? Did they end up sitting together? I don't have that information, Linda said. But Mr. Chen, that wasn't your responsibility. You're not obligated to give up a seat you paid for, regardless of anyone else's circumstances. Our crew should have known that. His new boarding pass printed, and Linda handed it to him along with a voucher for the airline lounge. You can wait in the lounge. Free food, drinks, Wi-Fi. Your flight board's in about 90 minutes from gate 41. Again, I apologize for what happened here today. James took the papers, but he felt numb. 3 hours late? His meeting was supposed to start in 4 hours. Even with the time zone difference, he'd barely make it, and he'd be rattled and exhausted when he got there. But as he walked toward the lounge, his phone started buzzing. Text messages, notifications, emails flooding in. He pulled it up and felt his blood run cold. Someone had posted video of the incident. Not his video, but one of the other passengers. And it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, TikTok. The hashtag was already trending. Thousands of views. Tens of thousands. The numbers kept climbing as he watched. The video showed everything from a different angle. James sitting quietly in his seat. Patricia's aggressive body language. Robert's threats. The security officers escorting him off. And the caption, "Man kicked off flight for refusing to give up seat he paid for." This is wrong. The comments were pouring in. Hundreds of them, thousands. People were outraged. They were tagging the airline, demanding answers, calling for boycotts. News outlets were picking it up. Passenger removed after declining seat switch, read one headline. Airline under fire for treatment of customer, read another. James sat down hard on a bench, staring at his phone in disbelief. This was spiraling out of control. What had started as a simple no to a seat change request had turned into a viral moment, and he was at the center of it. His phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Is this James Chen? A woman's voice asked. Yes? Mr. Chen, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm the regional director for the airline. I've just been made aware of the incident this morning, and I wanted to reach out to you personally. James closed his eyes. Here it comes, he thought. The damage control. The corporate response. Mr. Chen, I've reviewed all available footage and documentation of what occurred. On behalf of the airline, I want to offer you my sincere apologies. What happened to you this morning was completely unacceptable, and it does not represent our values or our standards of service. Okay, James said carefully, not sure where this was going. I'd like to meet with you in person when you arrive in Seattle. We need to discuss this matter further, and I want to ensure that we address your concerns appropriately. Would you be willing to do that? James thought about his meeting, his presentation, his 3 years of work. But he also thought about that video going viral, about all those people commenting about the wrongness of what had happened. Yes, he said. I'll meet with you. As he hung up, James realized something. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And somehow his quiet refusal to give up his seat had started something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. James sat in the airline lounge, his untouched coffee growing cold on the table beside him. His eyes were glued to his phone screen, watching the numbers climb. Views, shares, comments. It was like watching a wildfire spread in real time. The video now had over 2 million views. 2 million people had watched him being escorted off that plane. The comments section was a mix of outrage and support, with a few critics scattered in between. "This is exactly what's wrong with airlines today," one comment read. "He paid for his seat. End of story," said another. "Airlines treat passengers like cattle. Good for him for standing his ground." But there were also comments that stung. "He should have just switched seats. It's not that big a deal." Imagine ruining a couple's honeymoon over a seat. Some people are so entitled. James wanted to respond to those comments, to explain about his back, about the money he'd paid, about the principle of the thing. But his lawyer brain told him to stay silent. Anything he said now could be used against him later. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his business partner, David. "Dude, you're all over the news." "What happened?" James typed back quickly. "Long story. We'll explain later." "Did you reschedule the Seattle meeting?" "Yeah, pushed it back 4 hours." They saw the news too. "Everyone's asking if you're okay." At least that was something. The meeting was still on. James leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, a news alert popped up on his screen. "Breaking, airline faces backlash after passenger removal video goes viral." He clicked on it. The article had quotes from aviation experts, passenger rights advocates, even a statement from the airline's PR team. The statement was carefully worded, promising a full investigation while not admitting any wrongdoing. Classic corporate response. But what caught his attention was a quote near the end of the article. "We've identified a pattern of complaints involving one of the crew members in question," an anonymous airline source said. This incident may be part of a larger issue, a pattern. That meant Patricia had done this before. How many other passengers had she bullied into giving up their seats? How many had just complied because it was easier than fighting back? His boarding time approached, and James made his way to gate 41. A few people recognized him as he walked through the terminal. Some gave him supportive nods. Others stared. One teenager asked for a selfie, which felt surreal and uncomfortable, but James politely declined. The flight to Seattle was uneventful, which James appreciated more than he could express. The first-class seat was comfortable. The flight attendants were professional and kind, and nobody asked him to move. He tried to work on his presentation, but his mind kept drifting back to the morning's events. When they landed in Seattle, James's phone exploded with notifications again. The story had grown even bigger while he was in the air. Major news networks were covering it now. The airline had released a second statement, this one slightly more apologetic. "We are conducting a thorough review of this morning's incident. We take passenger concerns seriously and are committed to ensuring all travelers are treated with dignity and respect." James collected his luggage and headed toward ground transportation. That's when he saw her. Jennifer Walsh, the regional director, was waiting near baggage claim with a man in a suit who looked like he belonged in a law firm. "Mr. Chen," Jennifer said, extending her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. This is Richard Torres, our chief legal counsel for the Western region." James shook both their hands, his guard immediately going up. A lawyer. This was more serious than he'd thought. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Jennifer asked. They ended up in a conference room at the airport's business center. James sat on one side of the table, Jennifer and Richard on the other. It felt like a negotiation, which he supposed it was. Jennifer started. "Mr. Chen, I've spent the last 4 hours reviewing every detail of what happened this morning. I've watched your video. I've watched the videos other passengers posted. I've reviewed the crew's statements, the security reports, and your passenger history with us." She paused, and James waited, his heart pounding. "What happened to you was wrong," Jennifer said simply. "There's no other way to say it. You were harassed, threatened, and ultimately removed from an aircraft for exercising your right as a paying passenger. That's not acceptable. That's not who we are as a company." James felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "Thank you for saying that. But I need you to understand something," Jennifer continued. This situation has become very public very quickly. We have reporters calling. We have social media campaigns calling for boycotts. We have shareholders asking questions. This isn't just about making things right with you anymore. It's about how we respond as a company. Richard, the lawyer, leaned forward. Mr. Chen, we'd like to discuss a resolution with you. We're prepared to offer compensation for your experience, and we want to ensure you're satisfied with how we handle the situation going forward. What kind of resolution? James asked carefully. Full refund of your ticket, obviously. A significant travel voucher for future flights. An upgrade to our highest tier membership status. And a settlement payment to compensate you for the distress and inconvenience this caused. James studied them both. And in exchange? We'd ask that you sign a non-disclosure agreement, Richard said. You wouldn't be able to discuss the specific terms of our settlement or make further public statements about the incident. There it was. They wanted to pay him to go away quietly, to let the news cycle move on to the next story. To protect the airline's image, what about Patricia and Robert? James asked. The crew members who did this. What happens to them? Jennifer and Richard exchanged a look. That's an internal personnel matter, Jennifer said. I can't discuss specific disciplinary actions, but I can tell you that we're taking this very seriously. That's not good enough, James said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. I don't want hush money. I want accountability. I want to know that what happened to me won't happen to someone else. Mr. Chen, Richard began, but James held up his hand. Let me finish. I'm not trying to destroy your company or ruin anyone's career, but I also can't just take money and pretend this didn't happen. Other passengers recorded what happened. It's already out there. The only question is whether your airline is going to take real action or just throw money at the problem. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something James didn't expect. You're right. Richard looked at her in surprise, but she continued. You're absolutely right, Mr. Chen. This is bigger than one incident. When I started digging into the background this morning, I found 3 previous complaints about the flight attendant in question, 3 separate passengers who reported similar experiences. All of them were quietly compensated. None of them were told what actions we took. And clearly nothing changed because here we are again. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. This is what I'm proposing, not as a legal settlement but as the right thing to do. First, the crew member who initiated this situation is being terminated. Her employment ends today. The senior flight attendant who escalated it is being suspended without pay for 30 days and will undergo mandatory retraining before he can return to duty. James opened the folder. Inside were documents outlining everything she'd just said, along with additional information about policy changes the airline was implementing. We're also revising our policies, Jennifer continued. Crew members will no longer be permitted to pressure passengers who decline voluntary seat changes. We're implementing new training on passenger rights and de-escalation techniques, and we're creating a formal review process for passenger complaints that doesn't just quietly pay people off. Why are you telling me all this? James asked. Because you asked for accountability and you deserve to see it. And because I think you're going to be asked about this by reporters, by social media, by everyone who's following this story. I want you to be able to tell them the truth, that we didn't just write a check. We actually changed. James read through the documents carefully. Everything Jennifer said was there in black and white. Policy changes, training requirements, a commitment to transparency. What about the compensation? He asked. Still on the table, Richard said. You deserve it for what you went through, but it's not contingent on your silence. You're free to discuss the incident and our response however you choose. James thought about the 2 million people who'd watched that video. The thousands of comments from passengers sharing their own horror stories about airlines. The feeling of helplessness he'd felt sitting in that seat, being threatened for doing nothing wrong. I want one more thing, he said. What's that? Jennifer asked. I want to be part of the training. Not for publicity, not for attention. But I want your crew members to hear directly from a passenger about what this experience feels like. I want them to understand that we're not just seat numbers and ticket prices. We're people. Jennifer smiled, a real smile this time, not the corporate mask. I think we can arrange that. They spent another hour working out the details. James would receive his compensation, but more importantly, he'd have a voice in how the airline moved forward. He'd work with their training department. He'd be part of the solution, not just another problem they'd swept under the rug. When James finally left that conference room, the sun was setting over Seattle. He'd missed his original meeting, but David had handled the reschedule. Tomorrow he'd give his presentation. Tonight he had something else to do. He pulled out his phone and typed a message on social media. Thank you to everyone who shared my story today. I met with the airline and I'm grateful to say they're taking real action. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with accountability. More details to come. The responses came flooding in immediately, but James put his phone away. He'd dealt with enough screens for one day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to make sure something good came from this awful experience. For now, he just wanted to get to his hotel, order room service, and finally, rest. 6 months had passed since that Tuesday morning on Flight 447, and James still couldn't quite believe how much had changed. He was standing in a hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., adjusting his tie and trying not to look nervous. In 20 minutes, he'd be testifying before a congressional subcommittee on airline passenger rights. The meeting in Seattle had gone better than expected, by the way. He'd landed the deal for his app, secured funding for the next 3 years, and walked away with a partnership that exceeded his wildest expectations. The irony wasn't lost on him. If he'd just switched seats that day, he would have made it to the meeting on time but might have seemed desperate and unprepared. Instead, arriving late with a valid reason and a story that was national news, he'd walked into that room with a different kind of confidence. But that success felt small compared to what had happened since. The viral video didn't just disappear after a few days like most internet stories. It kept growing, kept evolving, kept sparking conversations about how airlines treated passengers. People started sharing their own stories. A woman in Boston who'd been forced to give up her seat despite having a disability. A father in Texas who'd been separated from his young children. An elderly couple in Florida who'd been threatened with removal for questioning a baggage fee. The stories poured in by the thousands, and James found himself at the center of something much bigger than one bad flight experience. True to their word, the airline had made changes. Real changes. Patricia was gone. Robert had completed his suspension and retraining, though James heard through the grapevine that Robert had ultimately chosen to transfer to a ground position where he wouldn't interact with passengers. The new policies were in place, and James had spent 3 full days at the airline's training facility, speaking to crews about passenger rights and the importance of de-escalation. He'd never forget standing in front of a room full of flight attendants, seeing some skeptical faces, some sympathetic ones, some that looked defensive. He'd told his story simply and honestly, not trying to vilify anyone, just explaining what it felt like to be treated that way. By the end, several attendants had come up to him privately, sharing their own frustrations with company policies that put them in impossible positions. But other airlines had pushed back. Industry groups had issued statements defending crew authority. Some commentators had accused James of being an attention seeker, of blowing things out of proportion, of trying to get rich off one bad experience. The criticism stung, even though James knew it wasn't true. That's what had led him here to this congressional hearing. A senator from Michigan had seen the video and the subsequent coverage. She'd been working on airline passenger protection legislation for years, and James's story had given her the momentum she needed to finally get a hearing scheduled. His phone buzzed. A text from David. "You've got this. Just tell the truth like you always do." James smiled and typed back a quick thanks. Another text came in, this one from his mom, watching on C-SPAN. "So proud of you, honey. Remember to sit up straight." Even in the most serious moments, his mother worried about his posture. A staffer poked her head into the room. "Mr. Chen, we're ready for you." James followed her down a hallway and into the hearing room. It was smaller than he'd expected from seeing them on TV, but still intimidating. The raised dais where the committee members sat. The witness table with its microphone and nameplate. The gallery behind him filled with reporters, advocates, and airline industry representatives. He took his seat and adjusted the microphone. Senator Williams, the woman who'd organized the hearing, gavelled the session to order. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "We're here to discuss airline passenger rights and protections, specifically in response to incidents that have highlighted gaps in our current regulatory framework. Mr. Chen, thank you for agreeing to testify." "Thank you for having me, Senator." "Mr. Chen, can you start by telling us in your own words what happened on April 15th of this year?" James took a breath and began. He'd told this story dozens of times now, but it still wasn't easy. He explained the seat request, his refusal, the escalation, the threats, the removal. He described how it felt to be escorted off that plane, knowing he'd done nothing wrong but being powerless to stop it. The committee members listened intently, asking clarifying questions. How much had he paid for his seat? Had he been offered compensation before being removed? Were other passengers involved? Then Senator Williams asked the question James had been waiting for. Mr. Chen, since this incident, you've become something of an advocate for passenger rights. Why? Why not just take the airline settlement and move on with your life? James leaned into the microphone. Because it's not just about me, Senator. After my video went viral, I received thousands of messages from people sharing their own experiences. People who'd been treated unfairly, who'd been bullied by crew members, who'd been charged hidden fees, who'd lost luggage and been given the runaround for months. The system is broken, and it's broken in a way that favors corporations over people. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not saying all airlines are bad or all crew members are bad. Most of them are trying their best in a difficult industry, but the current structure gives passengers almost no recourse when things go wrong. We're told the crew has absolute authority. We're told to file complaints that go into black holes. We're told to be grateful we got from point A to point B at all. Senator Williams nodded. And what do you think needs to change? I think we need clear, enforceable standards for how passengers can be removed from flights. Right now, it's too vague. Crew members can claim someone is disruptive based on almost anything, and there's no immediate review process. I think we need better training requirements for crew members on passenger rights and de-escalation, and I think we need a real enforcement mechanism, not just voluntary compliance that airlines can ignore. Another senator, this one from Texas, jumped in. Mr. Chen, the airlines argue that crew authority is essential for safety, that if we start second-guessing crew decisions, we put flights at risk. How would you respond to that? I'd say there's a difference between safety decisions and customer service decisions, Senator. If someone is genuinely being threatening or dangerous, absolutely. The crew needs authority to handle that. But asking me to switch seats wasn't a safety issue. Refusing to switch wasn't disruptive. The disruption came when crew members decided to escalate a simple no into a removal situation. The hearing went on for another hour. Other witnesses testified, including passenger rights advocates, airline industry representatives, and FAA officials. The industry reps pushed back hard, arguing that additional regulations would increase costs and complexity. James listened to them talk about operational efficiency and competitive pressures, and he understood their concerns. But he also knew that efficiency and profit couldn't come at the expense of basic dignity. When it was over, James was swarmed by reporters in the hallway outside the hearing room. Cameras, microphones, questions shouted from every direction. Do you think the legislation will pass? Are you satisfied with how your airline handled the situation? Have you flown since the incident? James answered what he could, trying to stay focused on the message rather than his personal story. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about creating change that would protect other passengers. That evening, back in his hotel room, James watched the news coverage of the hearing. The story led several broadcasts. Social media was buzzing again. Some praised his testimony. Others criticized it. The debate raged on. His phone rang. It was Jennifer Walsh, the regional director from the airline. I watched your testimony today, she said. James braced himself for criticism, but her tone was neutral. You did well. You were fair, which I appreciate. You didn't throw us under the bus, but you didn't let the industry off the hook either. I tried to be honest, James said. I know this might sound strange coming from me, but I hope the legislation passes. Not in its current form, maybe, but some version of it. We need clearer standards. We need better training. We need accountability. You were right about that from the beginning. After they hung up, James opened his laptop and checked his email. Messages from advocacy groups wanting his support. Invitations to speak at conferences. Interview requests from podcasts and news shows. His quiet life as a software engineer felt like it belonged to someone else now. But mixed in with all the noise was an email that made him smile. It was from the older woman who'd spoken up for him on the plane that day. She'd seen the hearing and wanted him to know she was proud of him. You could have just taken the money and moved on, she wrote. But you chose to fight for something bigger. That takes courage. Keep going. James closed his laptop and looked out the window at the DC skyline. He thought about that morning 6 months ago. when all he'd wanted was to sit in his assigned seat and get to Seattle on time. He'd had no idea that one simple no would lead to all of this. The legislation Senator Williams was proposing would take months to work through committees, amendments, debates. It might pass. It might not. But the conversation had started, and that mattered. James had learned something important through all of this. Change didn't happen because one person had a viral moment. It happened because that moment sparked others to action. Because people saw themselves in the story and decided they deserved better. Because enough voices joined together to demand accountability. He'd been asked in the hearing if he regretted not just switching seats that day, if he thought it would have been easier to avoid all this attention and controversy. His answer had been simple and honest. No, Senator. I don't regret it. Because sometimes standing up for yourself is about more than just yourself. Sometimes it's about standing up for everyone who comes after you. Looking out at the city lights, James knew there was still work to do. More testimonies to give, more stories to share, more progress to fight for. But for tonight, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that things could actually change. Hope that one person's voice could matter. Hope that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, was always worth it in the end. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone was asked to give up their seat unfairly, they'd feel empowered to say no, because they'd know they weren't alone. Because they'd seen that standing your ground could lead to something bigger than yourself. That was worth every uncomfortable moment, every critical comment, every sacrifice along the way. James picked up his phone and sent one last message before bed, posting it publicly for all those people who'd supported him through this journey. Thank you for believing that passengers deserve respect and dignity. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for demanding better. This isn't over, but together we're making progress. Keep speaking up. Keep standing firm. Change is possible. Within minutes, the responses poured in. Thousands of them, each one a reminder that he'd done the right thing. That his simple refusal to switch seats had sparked something real and lasting. And that was the best ending he could have hoped for.